Our next topic is overtime pay. So what is overtime pay? Overtime pay is simply extra pay for working long hours. Now, not everyone is eligible for overtime pay. The general rule is you are only eligible for overtime pay if you are paid hourly. So if a worker is eligible for overtime pay, the overtime rate is usually 1.5 times the employee's regular hourly rate for every hour worked in excess of 40 hours in a week. For example, a worker is paid $12 per hour. If she is eligible for overtime, her overtime rate is $18 per hour, which is calculated by taking her regular rate of $12 per hour and multiplying it by 1.5. But some companies choose to round the overtime rate to 3 digits. So here's an example of a company rounding to 3 digits. Let's say a worker is paid $9.95 per hour. If the company chooses to round the overtime rate to 3 digits, her overtime rate is 14.925 per hour. If the company instead elected to round overtime to 2 digits, her overtime rate would instead be 14.93 per hour. So pay close attention to the homework and the test to see if the problem states if the company rounds overtime rate to 3 digits or 2 digits. Usually in the real world it's 2 digits, but sometimes they do 3. So let's do an example. Let's say an employee worked 47 hours in a week and is paid $8.75 per hour and receives 1.5 times her regular rate for overtime hours in excess of 40 hours per week. We need to calculate her net pay this week, assuming she has weekly deductions of $50. Now this is important, which is why I underlined it and put it in bold. This company chose to calculate the overtime rate to 3 decimals. So the first step is just to calculate her pay for the first 40 hours. So we're going to take 40 hours, multiply by 8.75, and we get $350. The next step is to calculate her overtime rate. So we're going to take her regular rate of $8.75 per hour, multiply it by 1.5, and remember this company rounds to 3 decimals. So the answer for overtime rate is $13.125 per hour of overtime. The next step, we have to figure out how many hours of overtime she worked, and then multiply it by step 2, the overtime rate. So her overtime pay is $13.125 times the 7 hours of overtime. That gives us $91.88. Now notice this overtime pay is actual pay, so we must round this step to 2 decimals. Step 4, the gross pay is the $350 of regular pay for the first 40 hours, plus her overtime pay of $91.88. So her gross pay is $441.88, and net pay, we're just going to subtract the $50 of deductions, and we get $391.88. Let's do another example. An employee worked 47 hours, is paid 8.75 per hour, and receives 1.5 times their regular rate for overtime hours in excess of 40 hours per week. So everything's the same as before. The only difference is this company chose to calculate overtime rate to 2 decimals. So the first step is the same as before. Calculate her regular pay for the first 40 hours. So we take $8.75 an hour, multiply it by 40, gives us $350. The next step is to calculate the overtime rate. To do that, you take the regular rate of $8.75 per hour, multiply it by 1.5, and remember this company is rounding to 2 decimals. So the overtime rate is $13.13. Then we're going to multiply that by the 7 hours of overtime, gives us overtime pay of $91.91. Gross pay is then $350 plus 91.91 gives us $441.91. And the net pay, we're just going to subtract the $50 of deductions, and we get net pay of $391.91. Now in these two examples, the difference between using a 2 decimal overtime rate and a 3 decimal overtime rate was 3 cents. So it does help the employee if they round to 2 decimals instead of 3 decimals. Now this is really important. You must calculate the overtime rate as a separate step and round the overtime rate appropriately. If you try to calculate it in one step, you will get an incorrect result, even if you set the decimal selector to 2 decimals. Because the calculator only rounds the final result, not the intermediate step. So we're going to do an example. An employee worked 47 hours, is paid $8.75 per hour, and receives 1.5 times the regular rate for overtime hours over 40 hours per week. Here's the correct way to calculate overtime pay. You calculate the overtime rate, so $8.75 an hour times 1.5 equals 13.13. Now, in this case, we're rounding the overtime rate to 2 decimals. And then to calculate the overtime pay, you take the 13.13 times the 7 hours of overtime hours gives us $91.91. This is the correct answer. Now here is the incorrect way. Some students assume they can calculate the answer this way. They enter $8.75 per hour times 1.5. They don't hit equal, and then they multiply it by 7 overtime hours, and they would get $91.88. But this is incorrect. This incorrect result happens even if the calculator is set to 2 decimals, because the decimal selector only rounds the end result. The overtime rate needs to be a separate calculation and round to 2 decimals as shown in this step. So you must do these 2 steps individually and round appropriately. Now just a reminder from PowerPoint 1, if a problem says to round to the nearest cent, that means round to 2 decimal places. So let's do another example. An employee worked 42.25 hours, is paid $10.25 per hour, and receives 1.5 times her regular rate for overtime hours over 40 hours per week. Calculate her gross pay. So this is important. This company chose to calculate overtime rate to 3 decimals. So the first step is the same as always. Calculate her pay for the first 40 hours. So that's 10.25 times 40 hours gives us $410. Next, calculate the overtime rate. Now remember, this company chose to round to 3 decimals. So 10.25 times 1.5 gives us an overtime rate of 15.375. Then we calculate her overtime pay. So it's the overtime rate, 15.375, times the amount of hours in excess of 40, so that's 2.25 hours, gives us $34.59. Now this you have to round to 2 decimals because this is an amount you're actually going to pay the employee. And then the next step is to calculate the gross pay, and that's $410 of regular pay plus $34.59 of overtime pay gives us gross pay of $444.59.